back to StabilityWOD, day 22, getting very close to my 30-day initial goal, which is when I feel like this kind of becomes a habit, and I hope to continue it because I have so much to share. We've been talking about the foot, and today I want to talk specifically about the gait cycle and what happens to the foot when we land in both a heel striking gait type and with a midfoot striking gait type. And yesterday I hinted to the idea that our lower leg muscles and the muscles in our feet really act like a built-in orthotic. So as many of us use orthotics, there are a lot of us that really don't need those. If our foot muscles are strong enough to do their job day to day, and then eventually we build them up to the point where they can do that job when we're running and on one foot and landing with impact on one foot, then the orthotic becomes unnecessary, and in fact can even make our feet weaker, just like wearing a brace would on any joint. So today I just want to show some slow motion video of what happens to the foot and how dynamic it is during the gait cycle, and then that'll start a larger conversation about what we do about it when the foot isn't able to tolerate the impact of landing and running. The first image here is me heel striking in shoes. You can see I land supinated, my foot's relatively stable, and the muscles are supporting me until I go to a foot flat position where I pronate to absorb shock, and the muscles in my lower leg and the bottom of my foot work to control that before finally toeing off, where my foot has to resupinate, has to get rigid again to support my calf in propulsion forward. You can see another view here of me heel striking in a stable position. My arch is high, and my lower leg and foot muscles have to be ready to accept the weight of my body. I pronate and I absorb that shock before finally resupinating. My arch comes back up and my foot gets stable so I can propel myself forward. Here it is continuous in slow motion, supinated, pronated, resupinated for propulsion. One more time, heel strike supinated, my foot muscles work to control pronation and then get me resupinated so I can take off. Now compare this to a midfoot strike where the same thing happens. I'm supinated, rigid foot until I hit the ground. As soon as my foot comes into contact with the ground, it pronates. My lower leg and muscles in the bottom of my foot have to work very hard to control that pronation so that I'm ready to resupinate before I take off and propel myself forward into the next step. You can see how fast this happens. Again, when I'm midfoot striking, when I land, my foot's supinated to start. I almost land on the outside of my foot, but very quickly I roll to my big toe side to accept the weight. The muscles in my lower leg support my foot so that my calf can be ready to contract very hard to propel me forward. These muscles have to resupinate my foot though, so my calf can actually efficiently do that, so my foot is stable for that to happen. Now, you're going to see in the next image the faster motion version of this, where I land slightly supinated, I pronate, and then very quickly I resupinate so my foot's rigid to propel myself forward. When you see me do this without shoes, you're going to see the same thing happen. I land supinated. I don't like to aggressively heel strike in bare feet, but it sort of shows you how this works. I pronate, absorb the shock from the ground briefly. The muscles in my leg are working very hard to be able to do this, and they also have to work hard to resupinate to make my foot rigid again so that I can toe off and move on to the next step. And of course the same thing happens on the other foot. There's a continuous view of me heel striking with no shoes on, so you can see that even without support, the same thing happens to my foot. Midfoot striking, landing supinated, landing with a slightly rigid foot. You can see my calf is already working to absorb the shock. The lower leg muscles that are deep to my calf and the muscles in the bottom of my foot are working to control pronation, supporting my calf to create stability in my foot, and then they quickly resupinate my foot so it can be rigid, and I have almost a spring, kind of like that carbon fiber foot I talked about in the past, to release energy into the next step. here's a faster motion version of the exact same midfoot strike with no shoes. So you get a sense for just how dynamic the foot is when it's landing, accepting impact, and then taking off. It really has the ability to land in a somewhat rigid position, very quickly unlock to absorb shock from the ground, absorb the ground reaction forces, and then re-stiffen or re-supinate so that it turns into a rigid lever for propulsion. And it does that whether we midfoot strike or whether we heel strike. There's a ton of information out there about how those things are different and how they have a different effect on different joints in the body. We're going to talk about that in the future, but tomorrow I want to get into the very basics of how we get these orthotic muscles activated online so that they can do this job better without us really having to think about it. Once we get the muscles back online, then we can have the conversation about how we train these muscles to learn how to accept impact and how we get familiar with that feeling of maintaining a stable foot when we're landing and taking off. So I hope you'll take a second to subscribe and share it with your orthotic wearing friends. I'll see you tomorrow.